What is up, guys? Randomonium here. This is your Week 3 Fantasy LCS analysis and prediction video for the 2017 Summer Split. In this video, we're going to break down all the matchups for Week 3 for both NA and EU LCS, and we will be discussing the results from Week 1 and Week 2. So if you haven't seen any of the matches from the previous weeks, this is your spoiler warning. I'm going to try and go a little bit faster in this video, though I have made a slight change based on a viewer request. So some people want me to get a little bit more detailed with the point values and the rankings and things like that. And I'm trying to strike a balance between time that I have to devote to these videos and also complexity, because the more detail I provide, the more complex it becomes, and then there will be a certain point where some people won't be able to follow it, or you'll have to pause the video and rewind it, and I want to try and avoid that. So I'm going to give you guys two options with this week, and you can let me know which one you prefer. So I'm going to give you an option where I just show you the letter grades, and I'm going to give you an option also where I'm going to show you rank 1 through rank 20, and let you decide if one of them is too much or too little information. So leave your comments below on which you prefer. I mean, ideally, I'd love to go into more depth. I understand that there are some limitations to the system that I currently have in place. I'd love to do more trending analysis and do standard deviations and algorithms for point predictions, but I just don't have the time to do that. Just in my personal life, I just started my new job, and I thought that they were going to actually give me some time to settle in, kind of learn the company, things like that, go through training and orientation. No, they kind of threw me into the deep end right away. My first week in, they already had me in charge of some really important stuff, which is great. I'm really enjoying my job, but at the same time, that's taking up a huge amount of my time because I'm not hourly, I'm salary. So I have to put in, if I have to put in 50 or 60 hours a week, then I have to put in 50 or 60 hours a week. There's no way around it. So that makes doing YouTube videos obviously harder. So with that said, this is the best video that I can put out in the time that I have this week. I am always trying to improve. I'm always trying to give you guys the best videos I can, and any constructive criticism is always appreciated. Just so long as it's constructive, just so long as it's respectful, I will always listen to your guys' feedback and try to improve and try to make these videos better. So without further ado, let's get into the breakdown. So we're going to go through Week 1 and Week 2 for both NA and EU, and that's going to allow us to kind of predict what we might see in Week 3. So you can see in Week 1, I did the letter grades. So I had S in purple, I had A in red, B in blue, C in green, and D in yellow. I'm doing the same thing in Week 2, but I'm going to be showing you guys the numbers. So 1 through 4 is S tier in purple, and then 5 through 7 is A tier in red, and then 8 through 10 is B tier in blue, 11 through 15 is C tier in green, and 16 through 20 is D tier in yellow. And they're obviously, the major issue with this system, with actually both of them, is that I don't show the difference in point values between the number 1 person and the number 2 person. So a lot of times there might be a 10 or even a 20 point difference between number 1 and number 2, or number 1 and number 3. And that's not reflected in these type of grading systems. So that is something that if you want to delve more into the statistics, I highly encourage you guys to actually look up the point values. And this is kind of a good starting point, but it's by no means an ending point if you guys want to really delve into the statistics. And I'm hoping that long term I'll be able to get back into that and give you guys some some really juicy predictions and things like that. So anyway, let's go through the teams as fast as possible and try and figure out who's going to do well this week, who's going to do not so well this week. So TSM, Week 1 and Week 2, they went 1-1. So you can see in Week 1 they were kind of C and B tier, and then Week 2 they had a couple in S tier. They've had Haunter in A tier, and then actually Doublelift did the worst overall compared to the people within his role. So that's the other thing that I forgot, is that all of these rankings are per role. So if I have Doublelift number 10, that means he was number 10 for 80 carries. That doesn't mean he was number 10, overall or anything like that. I'm not comparing double lift to the supports because obviously AD carries are going to get more points than supports. So all of these grades are within their specific role, and I'm not differentiating between NA and EU. I'm looking at both of them, which is why it's 1 through 20, vice 1 through 10. So based on this stuff, so TSM went 1-1, and they went 1-1 again. It seems like they're getting more fantasy points. They had closer matchups. Instead of having 2-0s like they did in week 1, they actually have 1-2s and 2-1s in week 2, which normally grants the 1-2s definitely grant more fantasy points, and then the 2-1s can grant more fantasy points depending on the scenario. A lot of times, like, the 2-0s actually provide more fantasy points than the 2-1s. But in this case, they had a really good matchup against CLG, and they put up a lot of fantasy points. This week, they've got a pretty favorable schedule. They've got Team Liquid and they've got Envy for week 3, so it looks pretty good for them. So I'm definitely got my eyes on, like, Bjergsen is definitely doing well. You can see that Svenskaren's kind of hit or miss. Hunter can be a little bit hit or miss. Pretty much the entire team is a little bit hit or miss, with the exception of Bjergsen. Bjergsen seems like he's pretty much always the top point scorer on TSM, but that's when they're going 1-1. If they go 2-0, then that's going to bump up most of the people on TSM into the S tier, or at the very least A tier. For Cloud9, we can see that Cloud9 has also improved. So the first week they went 0-2, but they still had decent points in Contracts and Jensen. And then in week 2, we can see that Contracts, actually compared to week 1, he was about the same, even though they went 2-0. So I guess that's kind of a little bit of a drop in performance, I guess you could say. But the rest of their team was phenomenal. They were all pretty much top 4. You can see that for top lane, between Ray and Impact, that's the reason why they ranked number 17, is because they're splitting the time. So I would not be playing Ray or Impact in week 3, but the rest of Cloud9 does well when Cloud9 goes 2-0, and then, as we'll see, they actually have a pretty favorable week 3. Phoenix 1 is kind of in free fall. You can see that in week 1 they went 0-2, but they were still able to have a pretty high performing bot lane. But we can see that in week 2 they're pretty much bottom of the barrel all across the board. They were ranked 20th in pretty much every single position. So they're kind of in free fall right now. I would probably just bench Phoenix 1 until they're able to turn a corner. They are a good team. I have no idea what's going on with them. My guess is that there's something going on internal to the organization, whether there's a coaching conflict or a player conflict. That's the only way that I can explain this kind of huge difference between the spring split and the summer split. So hopefully they can right the ship, and they can get back to their winning ways. But right now, I'd be very hesitant to start anybody on Phoenix 1. For FlyQuest started off really rocky, C tier across the board, and then here in week 2, they went 1-1, and you can see that they improved quite a bit. Balls actually did very well, surprisingly, and then High, of course, we would expect him to do the best out of anyone on FlyQuest. He definitely had the best performance overall, and they put up a ton of team points, so that's something that you got to keep in mind as well, is that I guarantee you that a lot of people don't have FlyQuest as their team. So if you have a team that's not performing very well, you might want to consider FlyQuest if they've got a favorable week. CLG has been performing really well. They started off really well week 1. They were 2-0. Pretty damn good fantasy points. Darshan was definitely a standout there. And then in week 2, Darshan again was a standout. So if you got Darshan on your team, you've got gravy. Because I think a lot of people were underestimating Darshan coming into the split, myself included. But he's really performing well. He's performed really well 2 weeks in a row. Week 3 will probably be very good for him as well. And then the rest of the team is doing decent. I think Huhi's been struggling a bit. You can see that Aframu had a pretty low ranking in week 2. But Aframu actually, he played really well. I guess he just had too many deaths. But yeah, CLG is a pretty solid team right now, and they have a pretty favorable week 3. But we'll get into that in the next couple slides. Dignitas, another team that's very surprising. This really is because of Someday is the freaking heart and soul of this team right now, and he is an absolute monster. I know it's not reflected in his fantasy points from week 2, but he hard carried his team. Like, he is an amazing top laner, and the Dignitas versus TSM match was one of the best matches I've seen. Maybe not the most technical matches I've seen, but oh my god, was it entertaining. Watching Hanser go toe to toe versus Someday was like a freaking Rocky film. It was amazing. I loved it. But yeah, he had a couple more deaths than he probably should have, which kind of dropped down his fantasy points a bit. But he is really, really good. And if you got him on your team, then I think you're pretty lucky. And then the biggest issue actually with Dignitas right now is we don't know if Shrimp is going to be starting or Chaser, because Shrimp started and he played phenomenal. Shrimp came off the bench and shocked the world. It was unbelievable how well he played. And then they substituted in Chaser for Game 3 versus Team Liquid, which was the game they lost, which is kind of weird. But yeah, I mean, I have no idea if Dignitas is going to start Chaser or Shrimp. So I'd be kind of hesitant to start either of them unless we get like official word from Dignitas on who's going to start for Week 3. Immortals. This is probably one of the most bipolar teams that we've had so far this split. Week 2 is usually a week of upsets, and this was definitely no exception. Week 6 is usually also really bad, but week 2 was, oh god, there were so many upsets that it made my life kind of hellish trying to make predictions. But you can see that in week 1, Immortals played phenomenal, and then in week 2, surprise, surprise, they didn't do as well. So yeah, they were pretty low ranked, so it's kind of hard to say where Immortals lies right now. So this week they've got the kind of week where you don't know which Immortals is going to show up. You don't know if the week 1 Immortals is going to show up. You don't know if the week 2 Immortals is going to show up. So that definitely kind of increases their risk factor. And you got to be a little bit more hesitant to play them. So just keep that in mind. I mean, I'm not saying they're going to do poorly. I'm just saying that there are some lower risk picks out there compared to Immortals, so we don't know which Immortal is going to show up for week 3. Echo Fox is another team that has been kind of interesting to watch. You know, I mean, Froggen is just always good. He always seems to, like, no matter if he's even on a horrible team, he always puts up good fantasy points. So if you've got Froggen on your team, I think he's a great flex pick. Or if your normal starting mid laner has a really bad matchup, then he might be a good starter as well. But you can see that even so, Fox went 2-0 in the first week, and then they went 0-2 in the second week, and yet he still was A tier in both weeks. So he's pretty consistent as far as points are concerned. So just kind of keep that in mind. Team Liquid was probably one of the biggest surprises coming into week 2. I don't think a lot of people expected them to win any games this week, but they were able to go 1-2 against Envy, and they were actually able to beat Dignitas, which was very surprising. And yeah, Golden Glue actually had a really good performance. Piglet had a good performance. Matt had a good performance. I feel like it's a little bit too early to call the ball on Team Liquid, because you can see in their week 1 they did horrible. So it's going to be, I think this week 3 is going to be really kind of a crucial week for them. If they're able to take a match, or at least take a couple games off their opponents in week 3, then you might be looking to pick up maybe Piglet. I think Piglet is probably your safest bet if you really need another 80 carry or something like that. Envy is another team that is doing surprisingly well, but their fantasy points are not reflecting that. So we can see that they went 1-1 in week 1, and they were kind of C tier, B tier, which is what we would expect. And then they went 2-0 in week 2, and they were still C tier, B tier. In fact, they were actually a little bit better. But yeah, you kind of would expect them to be higher than that. You should then be kind of at least A tier with that kind of performance. So that's kind of interesting. I definitely have picked up an Envy player or two here or there, because a lot of them are available in leagues where my draft went really badly. So if your draft went really badly, you might want to take a risk with some Envy players. But for the people who are doing well in their fantasy leagues, there's probably nobody that you want to pick up on Envy right now. Alright, so let's go over to EU. So EU has been a little bit more consistent. There was definitely some upsets in week 2. but they weren't like crazy upsets. So we can see week 1, you see a lot of S tier teams and you see a lot of D tier teams. So let's look at week 2. So we can see that, let's start at the top. So let's start off with G2. So G2 had a bunch of subs in week 1, so we really can't count that, I don't think. I mean, Sven did well, but you really can't count that. So they basically have 1 week of data. We can see in week 2, they went 1-1, so they got upset by Fnatic, which is a phenomenal series. They were able to stomp Ninjas, but the only person who did well as far as points is concerned is Sven. So that's kind of interesting. I think that they're underperforming right now. I think that week 3 will probably be better for them. I'm not sure how much better, but I definitely think it's going to be better for them, especially if you get Sven. He's definitely a starter. Unicorns of Love, like I said in the preseason, they always put up points. Like, Unicorns of Love always puts up points, and this is no exception. You can see that they were, 1-2 for a lot of their positions. Exile had a bit of a rough week, and they didn't score that many team points, but you can see that week 1 to week 2, they're a pretty solid pick. So yeah, I definitely, if you got a lot of Unicorns players, then good for you. You're probably not going to be able to get any, but if you're able to trade anybody, it's probably a good deal. Fnatic is another team that I think is has high point potential, but we can see what the risk is with Fnatic when you only have 1 match. So we can see that in week 1, they were S tier across the board. They put up, ridiculous fantasy points. Week 2, they only had 1 match against G2, and they were able to go 2-1 against G2. But that loss, right, because they only count the first 2 matches, that loss really dropped their fantasy points because they only had 1 match that week, and the points are doubled if you only have 1 match. So this is kind of a very good indicator for you people out there that if you've got a team that's only got 1 match in a week, if they go 2-1, these are the type of results that you should expect. Kind of B tier, maybe C tier. If they lose, then they're almost guaranteed to go into the D tier range. So you got to be really careful with these teams that only have 1 match every week, because if they don't stomp, if they don't 2-0, then they're at risk to being only like middle of the pack at best. Even though Fnatic played phenomenal, they still didn't have that many fantasy points because they only had 1 match and they lost one of those games. They essentially went 1-1 as far as fantasy points is concerned with their matches. Misfits is another team that, we can see how 1 match affects you. So week 1, they had the 1 match against Fnatic. They got 0-2'd by Fnatic, D tier across the board. Week 2, they went 2-0, and then all of a sudden, whoa, they're S tier and A tier, which is what we would expect them to be, because Misfits is another team like Unicorns of Love that puts up a lot of fantasy points. So this is another thing to look at, is that, Misfits, just because they get, they did poorly doesn't mean they're a bad team. It just means you have to be more selective when you play them, because it looks like they're about like the number 3 team in their group. So that means that if they're playing somebody above them, in their group, then you probably want to bench them. If they're playing somebody below their group, then you definitely want to start them. So keep that in mind with Misfits. H2K, another team that, very interesting to look at the difference between week 1 and week 2. Week 1, 2 matches, 2-0'd both matches, S tier. Week 2, lose a close one to Unicorns of Love. And what do we got? We got, actually, surprisingly, Yankos and Odoamne were S tier, and that's mainly because they just didn't die. And then the rest of the team is C tier, which is what you'll see if a team goes 1-2, and they only have 1 match in a week. The fact that Yankos and Odoamne still were S tier is incredibly shocking, and just shows you how good they are from a fantasy points perspective. But yeah, so this is the danger of playing some of these EU players. Splice, same thing, right? 1 match, week 1, went 0-2, D tier. Week 2, they had 2 matches, they went 2-0, and they were S tier almost across the board. So Splice, another great team that can put up a lot of fantasy points if they've either got 2 matches or they're going to 2-0 their opponent, when in a 1 match week. Vitality is kind of in free fall right now. I was expecting them to actually do pretty well against Splice because Yamato Cannon's got the Splice playbook, but they got 0-2'd by Splice. So that doesn't bode well for Vitality at all. And yeah, you can see week 1 to week 2, they're D tier both weeks. Rockcat, this is another team that's kind of surprising. I think people kind of overlooked the fact that they played against G2, and yeah, G2 had 3 subs, but they didn't look horrible. I mean, they didn't look like they were the worst team against G2. And then against Misfits, they actually looked pretty good. Granted, Misfits has not been looking as good as they did last split, but I mean, Rockcat is by no means like a last place team. I think that they're probably a pretty sure 4th place team right now. So I don't think that there's many people you want to play on Rockcat, but yeah, they're not as bad as a lot of people make them out to be. And then Monkeys, they've been just kind of getting slaughtered lately. People have just been slaughtering the Monkeys, and yeah, it's kind of hard to judge how well they perform if they actually won a game. So I guess we're gonna have to. I would just say don't pick up anybody on Monkeys until they win a game and we actually find out how good they are. And then Ninjas, same thing can be said. They actually did, decent week 1. They actually went C tier, even though they went 0-2 against Fnatic. And then you'll see in week 2, they weren't the bottom of the barrel, but they were close to it. So yeah, I think Ninja Pajamas has a little bit higher point potential than Monkeys does from a fantasy points perspective, but it doesn't mean that you should necessarily start people. They're still D tier for the most part. Okay, let's look at the week 3. Let's look at the week 3. So this is going to be a little bit controversial. So S tier: CLG, TSM, Cloud9, H2K, and Fnatic. So let's break it down. CLG this week is going up against FlyQuest and Phoenix 1. FlyQuest and Phoenix 1 have both looked a lot shakier compared to the spring split, while CLG has looked really, really good. I expect that CLG will be able to beat both of them, which is why I have them in the S tier, especially since CLG has been putting up a lot of numbers. So CLG, I think, is a pretty solid S tier pick for most of the players, especially Darshan and Dardoch would probably be 2 really good options. TSM is another team that I think is S tier for week 3. They're going against Team Liquid and Envy. Team Liquid did have that one match against Dignitas in week 2, and Envy has been looking actually pretty dang good, surprisingly. But I do think that TSM is kind of getting back into their regular form. I expected TSM to have kind of a rocky beginning of this split because they went to MSI, they didn't have a lot of time off, and to make things worse, they had a really horrible performance at MSI, which definitely weighs on you as an organization. They feel like they let down the entire NA region. So that's rough, right? You practice really hard for something, you get your ass kicked, and then you don't get any break, and then you have to go right back into the summer split. That really sucks. So I think that, historically, we see that teams that go to MSI perform worse when they come back at the beginning of the summer split. But I think that TSM will, pick up steam as they go along in the split, and I do think that they're a pretty solid pick, especially Bjergsen. Bjergsen is definitely the most stable out of anyone on the team, but I mean, the whole team is really good. Like, you can't say that anyone on TSM is not worth picking up for your fantasy team. Cloud9, another team that has nothing but superstars on it. The only people that I'd avoid would be obviously Impact Ray, because they're doing the whole substitution thing. Cloud9 has got Immortals and FlyQuest this week, so they are a little bit higher risk, right? Because if Immortals shows up, they could definitely give Cloud9 a run for their money. And then FlyQuest is unpredictable, but I definitely think that Cloud9 can beat FlyQuest this week. So Cloud9 is a little bit higher risk than the other 2 NA teams. But I still think that they're going to go 2-0, and I still think they'll be S tier. H2K and Fnatic, so you can see that they're slightly higher risk but slightly higher reward in the S tier. This is because they only have one match this week. So Fnatic is going up against Rockcat, H2K is going against Vitality. I think that both of these teams, so if they find Fnatic and H2K, should be able to 2-0 their opponent, which should give them S tier fantasy points this week. So I would expect that most of the people on both Fnatic and H2K would be S tier or at the very least A tier. So if you got H2K Fnatic players, I definitely would play them. Moving on to the A tier, we've got Unicorns of Love, G2, and Dignitas, surprisingly. I know that one might be a little bit surprising to you guys. So let's take a look. So G2 and Unicorns of Love, I've got them as A tier, vice S tier, because they've got a little bit stiffer competition. They've only got one match this week, which makes them higher risk. And G2 is going against Misfits, which I do think that G2 can beat Misfits. But if it's a 2-1 victory, then that's going to cause G2 to suffer from a fantasy points perspective. Likewise, Unicorns of Love is going against Splice. If Splice is able to take a game off of Unicorns of Love, then that is also going to hurt Unicorns of Love's fantasy points, which is why they're a little bit higher risk and a little bit lower reward this week. That said, I think that G2 and Unicorns of Love should be pretty solid picks, assuming you don't have someone in those other 5 teams that are in the S tier. Dignitas is kind of a dark horse this week if you feel like you want to live on the wild side a little bit, but you don't want to be too crazy. So Dignitas has got Phoenix One, and they've got Echo Fox. These are both teams that Dignitas can beat if they play well. But the thing that makes it a little bit higher risk is that they lost to Team Liquid, right? If Dignitas is able to beat Team Liquid in week 2, I would have been singing the praises of Dignitas and saying, oh, this is a really strong team, but they kind of had that little ripple. So it's kind of hard to say, are they going to go back to, stomping people, or are they going to have issues with bottom tier teams, which I think the Team Liquid is right now. It's kind of hard to tell. So they're a little bit higher risk, but I think that they can pay off, especially if you don't have a very strong fantasy team. If you want to throw, some bets in, Dignitas is probably a good bet because, with exception to probably Someday, I would say that quite a few people on Dignitas are probably available in your fantasy league. Let's talk about the B tier teams, and this is kind of going to be the teams in blue that are kind of my high risk, high reward teams. And I think that people are going to be kind of shocked that I've got Monkeys and Ninjas in Pajamas up here. And the reason why I have them up here is not because necessarily I think that they're great teams, it's because of their opponents. So, Monkeys is going up against Vitality, and Ninjas in Pajamas is going up against Rockcat. So I do think that Vitality is slightly better than Monkeys, and I do think that Rockcat is slightly better than Ninjas. That said, I do think that Monkeys and Ninjas are capable of an upset. And if they are able to come out guns blazing and somehow get a 2-0, they could shoot up into the A tier or the S tier because they've only got that one match this week. So it is possible this week for Monkeys or Ninjas to be very highly ranked this week. So this is a if you want to take a risk this week on Monkeys or Ninjas in Pajamas, this is the week to take them because they're probably not going to face weaker opponents than this week. So if you're struggling in your fantasy league and you got to take a gamble, this is your week to gamble on Monkeys or Ninjas in Pajamas. I think that Ninjas in Pajamas is probably a little bit of a better team as far as from a fantasy points perspective, but I think that Rockcat has shown a little bit more than Vitality, so that makes it kind of a little bit interesting. So yeah, I'll leave it up to you guys who you think is worth investing in. But yeah, if you're struggling in your fantasy league, this is a good week to pick up Monkeys or Ninjas in Pajamas if you need to take a gamble, because they are a gamble. But if you need to take a gamble, this is a good week to pick them up. Splice is back into the gamble status, so they had they were a gambling team week 1 because they had the matchup against H2K. And then week 2 they did really well. Week 3 they're now going up against Unicorns of Love, and that's their only match this week. So if they're able to take a game off of Unicorns of Love, I'd expect them to be around C tier. If they win 2 games against Unicorns of Love, that'll probably bump them up to B tier. And if they win both games against Unicorns of Love, then that bumps them up to A tier or S tier. However, them 2-0ing Unicorns of Love is very unlikely, which is why I have them as that really, really high-risk team. So I'd probably avoid playing Splice if I could. But, there are some times when, you don't have a better option. So just keep that in mind. If you can bench the Splice players, this is probably a good time to bench them. The same is kind of true for Misfits. So we saw how in week 1 they went up against Fnatic and they did really, really badly. They were kind of D tier across the board. This week they're going up against G2, which is as good as Fnatic or better. So there's definitely going to be a debate on that because obviously Fnatic beat G2 in week 2. But yeah, so you would expect that G2 and Fnatic are roughly equal. That means that G2 is most likely going to 2-0 Misfits as well, which means that Misfits will most likely also be D tier this week. But there's a possibility that Lightning strikes twice and that Misfits is able to channel some Fnatic and able to take a game off of G2 or possibly beat G2. But I think that's highly unlikely, which is why I have Misfits as my highest risk team. In the entire league this week. So yeah, I'd avoid them if you can. C tier, these are the teams that they're just meh. They might do well, they might not. Immortals and Envy. So I do think that Immortals and Envy are good teams, but this week is rough for both Immortals and Envy. So Immortals got Team Liquid, which they should be able to beat, but we don't know. We don't know which Immortals is going to show up, and we don't know which Team Liquid is going to show up. There's a lot of volatility in that match. And then they go up against Cloud9, and I do think that Cloud9's got the advantage. So at best, you're looking at Immortals being a 1-1 week, and possibly an 0-2. So that kind of puts them around that C tier, maybe B tier, unless they can pull up an upset. Same can kind of be said with Envy. They're going up against Echo Fox and they're going against TSM. So, I think that they got a slight advantage against Echo Fox, but I do think that they're at a disadvantage against TSM. So again, you're looking at best case scenario, probably 1-1, which probably put them C tier, B tier, which is why I have them C tier. So just keep that in mind. It's not a bad choice to start players on Immortals or Envy, but it's also not a good choice either. So it's kind of like your I don't have any other options kind of choice. And then for the D tier, these are the teams that I just feel like they're just a little bit too high risk for the reward that they provide. Those would be Echo Fox, Rockcat, FlyQuest, Vitality, Team Liquid, and Phoenix One. So with Echo Fox, I think the only person I'd consider starting would be Froggen, but they've got Envy and Dignitas this week. So Froggen, I think, could do well, but it's going to be an uphill battle for them. Rockcat, another team that, it's possible. Yeah, it's possible they do well. Like, Wadded has been doing well from the support position. He's probably been their best performer. But Rocket's got Fnatic and Ninjas in Pajamas this week. I do think they could possibly beat Ninjas in Pajamas, but I do think they're going to get stomped by Fnatic. And then FlyQuest. So FlyQuest has got CLG and Cloud9, which is a really rough week for them. High could possibly do well. He'd probably be the only person I consider, but probably not this week. I'd just say bench FlyQuest this week if you got him. Vitality hasn't shown anything, so I wouldn't start anybody on Vitality ever until they actually have a good week. Team Liquid, the only person that you would consider starting would probably be Piglet, but Team Liquid has got Immortals and TSM this week, so it's if Immortals flops again, then maybe they can do well. And if TSM, I don't know, takes the day off or something, then maybe they can do well. But I just think that there's better options out there. And the same can be said for Phoenix One. They've got Dignitas and CLG. They have not performed well this week. I would keep them on the bench until they have at least one solid week. That's my advice, is that they're just too high risk right now for the reward that you possibly could get. It's a very low probability of success if you start Phoenix One players this week. So that's my breakdown. I'm sorry if I didn't go into as much depth as you guys would like. You know, definitely was a little bit rushed for time. Definitely was working a lot. I'm going to be trying to make minor tweaks every week. But let me know if you guys prefer the numbers, or if you prefer just the letter grades. I know that the numbers can be, it's a lot of information. The letters make things a little bit simpler, but the numbers give you obviously more information, so some people might enjoy that. So let me know which one you prefer, and then understand that, you know, long term I'd love to get back to, you know, really doing some really deep, detailed analysis on, you know, predicting point values and things like that, and actually predicting like point spreads and probabilities of, you know, certain outcomes happening. But that requires a lot of time and effort to do, and I just don't have the time right now. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave a comment below. I will try to answer as many as I can. And if you got any suggestions, yeah, leave a comment. I will happily take any suggestions you have. If you have not subscribed yet and you reached this part of the video, then you definitely should subscribe. But I hope you all have a fantastic day. This is Randomonium signing off.